6th March 1942, RAF Portreath, Cornwall, England. The briefing room at RAF Portreath smelled of damp wool and cigarette smoke when Wing Commander Hugh Verity entered at 0430 hours, the coastal wind rattling the blackout shutters as 23 aircrew from No. 38 Wing stood in silence, their faces illuminated by the single overhead bulb that cast long shadows across the operations map pinned to the wall. The plan was unprecedented in its audacity. 7 Armstrong Whitworth Albemarle bombers would tow 7 General Aircraft Hamilcar gliders across 1,180 miles of enemy-controlled Mediterranean airspace to deliver critical supplies to the besieged island of Malta, where Axis forces had reduced the garrison to near starvation and the civilian population subsisted on fewer than 1,500 calories per day. Flight Lieutenant James Ballantyne, pilot of Albemarle V-1703, studied the route marked in red grease pencil, southwest across the Bay of Biscay, skirting Spanish Morocco, then a direct run past Vichy French Algeria, across the Narrows between Sicily and Tunisia, where Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica fighters patrolled in strength, finally descending toward Lucca Airfield under cover of darkness. Each Hamilcar glider carried 7,500 pounds of cargo, created Bofors ammunition, medical supplies, dried milk, tinned meat, spare Bristol Mercury engine parts for the Hurricane fighters, and bags of mail that represented the only communication between the island's defenders and the world beyond the siege. The meteorological officer reported favorable conditions, scattered clouds at 8,000 feet, moderate winds from the northwest, visibility 8 miles, but warned of thunderstorm activity over the Tyrrhenian Sea and increased enemy night fighter patrols following recent RAF bombing raids on Axis supply convoys. At 0445 hours, the crews walked across the wet tarmac toward the waiting aircraft, their breath visible in the cold March air. The sound of Bristol Hercules engines warming up echoing across the aerodrome as ground crews made final checks on tow cables and glider release mechanisms. Sergeant Peter Hollings, second pilot in Hamilcar G-14, settled into his seat and felt the wooden frame creak around him, the glider's fabric skin taut against the fuselage ribs, every sound magnified in the pre-dawn quiet. The Albemarle ahead surged forward at 0612 hours, the tow cable snapping rigid as the glider accelerated down the runway, wheels bouncing twice before lifting into the darkness, the lights of Portreath falling away beneath as the formation climbed steadily toward the channel. By 0700 hours, they had reached cruising altitude, the 7 pairs strung out in loose formation, each crew maintaining radio silence as they passed over the gray expanse of the Atlantic approaches, where U-boats prowled beneath the surface. The sun rose behind them at 0734 hours, illuminating the cloud deck below in shades of pink and orange, the gliders casting elongated shadows on the vapor as they pressed southward. At 0415 hours, they crossed into Spanish airspace, the tow pilots maintaining strict altitude discipline to avoid provoking Franco's nominally neutral but German-friendly air defenses, the rocky coast of Galicia visible through breaks in the clouds. The flight continued without incident through the morning, the monotonous drone of engines punctuated only by instrument checks and position reports passed via hand signals between tug and glider crews. At 1147 hours, Flight Lieutenant Ballantyne noted increased turbulence as they approached the Atlas Mountains, the Albemarle pitching and yawing in the thermals rising from the Moroccan desert, the tow cable oscillating violently as Sergeant Hollings fought to maintain formation, his hands aching from the constant pressure on the control column. The formation descended to 6,000 feet at 1320 hours to avoid a towering cumulonimbus cell that blocked their path, the air inside the gliders turning cold and thin as they skirted the storm's edge, rain drumming against the fabric skin. By 1500 hours, they had cleared the weather and turned due east toward the Algerian coast, the Mediterranean spreading before them in an endless blue expanse, broken only by whitecaps driven by the northwest wind. At 1643 hours, the radio operator in the lead Albemarle picked up enemy transmissions, German voice traffic on Luftwaffe frequencies, position reports suggesting fighter activity near the Sicilian coast. Wing Commander Verity signaled the formation to descend to wave-top height, the gliders dropping toward the sea in a shallow dive, leveling off at 200 feet, where the radar coverage was poorest and where the surrounding water would blend with the aircraft silhouettes to confuse visual detection. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon at 17:45 hours, casting a golden path across the water, the formation racing eastward into the gathering dusk as Malta lay somewhere ahead in the darkness, besieged and waiting, its fate dependent on the fragile combination of canvas, wood, and determination that now crossed the final 100 miles of hostile sea. 6 March 1942, 42 miles northwest of Malta, Mediterranean Sea. The light had faded to a deep purple when Flight Lieutenant Ballantyne spotted the first enemy aircraft at 18:47 hours, a Junkers U-88 night fighter silhouetted against the darkening sky to the northeast, its twin engines unmistakable as it patrolled a sector between Sicily and the North African coast. The formation had maintained radio silence for 13 hours, communicating only through prearranged light signals. But now the tow pilots pushed their throttles forward, coaxing additional speed from the laboring Hercules engines as they attempted to outrun the prowling Luftwaffe aircraft before full darkness could provide concealment. Sergeant Hollings watched the U-88 through the glider's small side window, tracking its movement as it completed a wide turn and began descending toward their altitude, the German crew likely having picked up the formation on their radar or spotted the distinctive silhouettes against the last remnants of daylight. At 18:51 hours, the night fighter opened fire from 800 yards, tracers arcing across the sky in glowing chains of red and orange, the rounds passing high and to the left as the Albemarle glider combination jinked violently to starboard, the sudden maneuver throwing Hollings against his harness as the tow cable went momentarily slack before snapping taut again with a jolt that shuddered through the entire airframe. The other pair scattered across the darkening sea, each tow pilot taking independent evasive action as the U-88 selected a target and pressed its attack. The German pilot firing again at 18:53 hours, this time striking Albemarle V-1709 in the port engine, which erupted in flame and smoke, the propeller windmilling uselessly as the pilot fought to maintain altitude while trailing fire. The glider attached to the stricken bomber, Hamilcar G09, piloted by Pilot Officer David Welch, released immediately as trained, the tow cable falling away as Welch banked hard left and began a controlled descent toward the water, hoping to ditch before the bomber exploded and took the glider with it in the blast. The Albemarle continued flying for another 45 seconds, its crew attempting to reach Malta despite the damage, but at 18:54 hours the fire reached the fuel tanks and the aircraft disintegrated in a brilliant orange fireball that illuminated the sea for miles in every direction, the shockwave rolling across the water like thunder as burning wreckage tumbled toward the waves. Welch managed to level the Hamilcar at 50 feet, the glider's nose high as it mushed toward the surface at 85 knots, striking the water at 18:55 hours with tremendous force that buckled the forward fuselage and threw both pilots through the windscreen into the cold Mediterranean, the cargo breaking loose and crushing the rear section as seawater poured through the ruptures in the fabric skin. Neither Welch nor his co-pilot survived the impact, their bodies recovered 3 days later by an RAF air-sea rescue launch operating from Malta. The remaining 6 pairs pressed onward through the darkness, the U-88 breaking off pursuit at 18:59 hours, either low on fuel or satisfied with its kill, leaving the formation to continue its approach unmolested. At 19:34 hours, the lead navigator identified Malta's coastline through the darkness, the island completely blacked out per standing orders, not a single light visible to guide the incoming aircraft, forcing the pilots to rely on dead reckoning and the faint phosphorescence of waves breaking against the rocky shore. The formation had planned to arrive at Lucca airfield at 2000 hours, but the encounter with the night fighter had cost them time and altitude, and now they approached the island from the northwest instead of the planned southern approach, complicating the landing sequence. At 18:47 hours, ground controllers at Lucca briefly activated the DREM lighting system, a line of dim hooded lamps marking the runway's edges, giving the pilots just enough illumination to orient themselves before shutting down again to avoid attracting enemy bombers. The first Albemarle released its glider at 1949 hours at 3,000 feet, the Hamilcar separating cleanly and banking into its approach, the pilot extending the massive landing flaps that increased drag and steepened the descent angle as the darkened runway rushed up beneath him. The glider touched down at 1951 hours with its wheels slamming onto the cratered limestone surface, bouncing once before settling as the pilot applied full brake pressure, bringing the aircraft to a stop 900 yards from touchdown with the undercarriage intact and the cargo secure. The second and third gliders followed at 2-minute intervals, both landing successfully despite the darkness and the rough condition of the runway, which had been patched repeatedly following Axis bombing raids but remained dangerously pitted with shell craters and blast damage. The fourth glider, G-17, piloted by Flying Officer Kenneth Morrison, misjudged his altitude in the darkness and approached too low, the landing gear striking a stone wall at the field's southern perimeter at 1958 hours, tearing away the right main wheel and sending the glider skidding sideways across the runway in a shower of sparks and torn fabric, finally coming to rest against a blast shelter with its starboard wing crumpled and its fuselage broken amidships. Morrison and his co-pilot climbed out uninjured, their cargo of ammunition intact despite the violent landing, and within minutes a ground crew had begun offloading the precious supplies under the direction of a harried logistics officer who had not expected any deliveries that night. The fifth and sixth gliders landed without incident, their pilots executing precise approaches despite fatigue and darkness, bringing the total successful deliveries to 5 aircraft carrying approximately 37,500 pounds of supplies, enough to extend Malta's resistance by another week, perhaps 2 if rationing was strictly enforced. At 20:09 hours, air raid sirens wailed across Lucca as enemy bombers approached from the north, the distinctive desynchronized throb of Henkel HE-111 engines audible over the sound of ground crews frantically unloading the gliders and dragging cargo toward the underground storage bunkers that honeycombed the airfield's perimeter, the race to secure the supplies before the bombs fell, consuming every available man as the last Albemarle turned for the long flight back to England and the island's defenders prepared for another night of bombardment. 7th March 1942. Lucca Airfield, Malta. The first bombs fell at 20:14 hours, high explosive ordnance that detonated in the darkness with sharp cracks that echoed across the limestone plateau, followed by the deeper rumble of 500-kilogram weapons that cratered the runway and sent columns of dust and smoke rising into the night sky. Squadron leader Anthony Mears, commanding the Lucca Ground Defense Detachment, stood in the operations bunker 20 feet underground and listened to the explosions ripple across the airfield while monitoring reports from the observation posts scattered around the field's perimeter, each post reporting bomb strikes, near misses, and the continuous roar of aircraft engines as the German crews made repeated passes over their target. The 5 gliders that had landed successfully sat exposed on the runway apron, their fabric skins vulnerable to blast damage and shrapnel, while ground crews worked frantically to strip them of cargo despite the bombardment, loading crates onto Bedford trucks that shuttled between the gliders and the storage bunkers in the brief intervals between bombing runs. At 20:23 hours, a string of incendiaries fell across the northern section of the field, igniting pools of aviation fuel that had leaked from damaged storage tanks during previous raids, the burning petroleum creating towering columns of oily black smoke that drifted across the runway and reduced visibility to near zero. Flight Lieutenant Ballantyne's Albemarle, which had released its glider successfully and turned for home, transmitted a final position report at 20:31 hours, indicating it had cleared Maltese airspace and was climbing to altitude for the return journey. But the aircraft was never heard from again, and post-war records suggest it was intercepted by Italian night fighters operating from Sicily and shot down over the central Mediterranean with no survivors. The bombing continued until 21:47 hours, when the last German aircraft departed northward towards Sicily, leaving Lucca's runway pocked with fresh craters and 2 of the landed gliders destroyed by direct hits, their cargo lost in the explosions that reduced the wooden airframes to splinters and burning fabric. The three surviving gliders had been completely stripped of supplies by 2200 hours, their empty hulks pushed to the field's eastern boundary where they would remain until broken up for salvage wood that the island's carpenters would use to repair damaged buildings and construct coffins for the mounting civilian casualties. By midnight, the tallies were complete. Operation Beggar had delivered approximately 28,000 pounds of supplies to Malta at the cost of 3 gliders, 2 Albemarle bombers, and 9 air crew killed or missing, a loss rate of 43% that ensured the operation would never be repeated despite its partial success. The supplies themselves, while desperately needed, represented less than 3 days' consumption for the island's garrison and civilian population, a temporary reprieve that did nothing to alter the fundamental strategic situation facing Malta's defenders. In the operations bunker, Squadron Leader Mears drafted his after-action report by the light of a kerosene lamp, documenting the arrivals, the bombing damage, the cargo recovered, and the human cost, his handwriting cramped and efficient as he recorded the details that would eventually make their way to London and into the classified files where such desperate measures were analyzed for future planning. The glider operation had proven that long-range supply delivery was technically feasible, but operationally unsustainable, the aircraft too vulnerable and the cargo capacity too limited to justify the losses incurred, and subsequent supply efforts would rely on fast mine-layer submarines like HMS Clyde and blockade-running surface vessels that could carry larger payloads with marginally better survival rates. At 0130 hours on 7th March, the air raid siren sounded again as another wave of bombers approached from Sicily, the Luftwaffe maintaining its relentless pressure on the island that would continue for another 4 months until the arrival of the August convoy finally broke the siege. Sergeant Hollings, who had landed successfully in Hamilcar G-14 and remained on Malta until evacuated by submarine 3 weeks later, recorded in his diary that the glider supplies were exhausted within 72 hours of delivery, distributed among the island's hospitals, anti-aircraft batteries, and hurricane squadrons that continued to contest Axis air superiority despite dwindling fuel and ammunition reserves. The operation's true value lay not in the tonnage delivered, but in the psychological boost it provided to Malta's defenders, demonstrating that Britain had not abandoned the island despite the seemingly impossible logistics of maintaining supply lines across 1,000 miles of hostile sea and airspace, and that even the most desperate measures would be attempted to sustain resistance until the strategic situation improved. The 6 Albemarle crews that survived the mission and returned to England received no public recognition, the operation remaining classified for decades after the war, but their names were recorded in squadron records alongside the notation Special Operations, Malta, that marked their participation in one of the war's most audacious and least successful supply missions. The wreckage of Hamilcar G-09, which ditched in the Mediterranean after its tow bomber was shot down, was located by marine archaeologists in 1987, lying in 840 feet of water 43 miles northwest of Malta, its cargo hold still containing sealed crates of ammunition and medical supplies that had remained underwater for 45 years, a silent testament to the mission's cost and the desperation that had motivated its conception. The recovered logbooks and personal effects from the wreck site provided historians with additional details about the operation's execution, confirming the timeline of events and the circumstances of the glider's loss, and allowing the families of Pilot Officer Welsh and his co-pilot to finally receive confirmation of what had happened on that March night in 1942. In London, the Air Ministry studied the operation's results and concluded that glider supply missions to Malta were impractical given the distance, enemy opposition, and limited payload capacity, and no similar operation was attempted for the remainder of the siege, leaving submarine and surface vessel convoys as the only viable means of sustaining the island's defense. The lessons learned from Operation Beggar would inform later glider operations in Sicily, Normandy, and Arnhem, where shorter distances and different tactical situations produced better results, but the Malta mission remained unique in its ambition and its failure, a footnote in the larger story of the island siege and eventual relief. By dawn on 7th March, the airfield crews had filled the worst of the bomb craters and returned Lucca to marginal operational status, allowing the handful of serviceable Hurricane fighters to scramble against the morning's first Axis raid, the continuous cycle of bombardment and defense that defined Malta's ordeal continuing without pause. The brief excitement of the glider deliveries already fading into memory as the garrison settled back into the grinding routine of survival under siege.